My name is Deborah Plutzik-Briggs. I'm Vice President for Arts and Community Engagement at the Betsy Hotel, and I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with you today with directors Christa Whitney and Emily Felder and subject Hadas Kalderon from the movie Who Will Remain, which is premiering at this year's festival. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to get into a conversation about the movie. I totally loved it. And I wanted to start with Hadas, with you, Hadas. I know that you guys know that my father was a Jewish American poet. And so I was really touched with the way your grandfather's life touched you and the way his poetry has been your connector to his life. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how compelled you felt to tell his story and to talk about his poetry, and when did it start for you? Just talk a little bit about that so we have that background.
Okay, well, first of all, my grandfather died 11 years ago, so it was 97. I had a lot of time with my grandfather. Mm-hmm. He died when he was very old, and he was my only grandfather. Mm-hmm. So I had a very strong connection with him. And since I was very young, I wanted to connect to him. It was my only grandfather. And I didn't know Yiddish. I was born, of course, in Israel. And in Israel, the Yiddish was neglected. The Hebrew language was in front. So I couldn't really connect about the poems, but I could connect to him because of the stories. So the stories interested me. And that's the only way I could really touch him. It wasn't the grandfather would take me to the yard and would put me, here on my lap and would play with me. No, Abrashe. I didn't even call him grandpa. I called him Abrashe. So he was a respected man for me since I was a kid. And the only way for me to really connect to him was by interviewing him. Mm-hmm. So he was a respected man sitting in his salon, yes, and the only way for me to reach him is by interviewing him. And I was very curious about the stories and the stories from wartime. I was very curious about this period of time. It would sound very strange to an outsider. What a child would ask about a wartime, but yes, because the stories brought, like he said, healing beauty, never stories with bad ending. But for me, he would tell me heroic stories. So like he said, our duty as people and as artists is to bring healing beauty to mm-hmm. the world that gives you power to live, strength to live. So these were the stories that give me strength and give me power. And I was empowered with those stories, with those heroic stories. The story that an airplane came to the forest to rescue a poet because of his poem.
Right, that's truly amazing. Story. That's truly amazing. And so one follow-up question about that. In the film, you talk about wanting to be a candle of remembrance. And I'm curious, are you talking, I mean, I don't want you to be literal with that, but just talk a little bit about that, about being a candle of remembrance for him or what he's connected to. I imagine it's both.
I will tell you this sentence, where it came from. 11 years ago, I was asked to perform in a theater, a co-production, Germany and Israel. And I grew up in a family that doesn't go to Germany. My grandfather even did not accept the payment from the Germans. And it was clear that we are not going to Germany and we're not buying German products. This is how I was raised. And this offer for this co-production really confused me. But then I decided, because it was a documentary theater, a chance to write our material, then I decided that I'm gonna go and I'm going to participate and bring the story of my family, bring the story of Abrashe and Frida and Safta Frida. And I went to Abrashe, I went to my grandfather and I asked him, Abrashe, what do you think about me going to Germany to tell your story? And he was old, he was 97 then, but I knew that he understood what I'm asking him, and he said yes. And I went to Germany and we worked on this act. And for 5 weeks, I brought everything that I could from Israel to this performance. I brought his Nuremberg trial testimony to show them. And I brought the book that translated poems in Deutsch. And I brought everything. I brought everything that I could remember that he told me from interviewing him my whole life. And we worked on this piece for 5 weeks. And then at the 20th of January, 2010, the evening of the premiere, the same evening, I get a phone call from my mother in Israel. And she tells me that Abrashe is gone, said goodbye. And I was so confused. I said, what? I shouldn't be here. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have come. I shouldn't have asked him this thing to come to Germany. And I said to everybody, and the audience are getting in, the audience are getting in, and I'm getting this phone call from Israel, and I'm in Germany. And I'm saying to everybody, listen, guys, I cannot go on stage. It's a mistake. I cannot do it. And then the dramaturg, the theater, took me and, shook me up. And he said, listen, Hadas, you got it all wrong. Because the minute that he knew and he felt that his story is in your hand and you lit a candle for him at the most darkest place, mm-hmm. then he could say goodbye. And you close the circle and you open another. And this is how life, continues. But when he knew that his story is safe, so he could say goodbye. And
that's a beautiful story. It's like when somebody's in hospice and they wait for permission, right, to move on. It sounds like you're feeling that he had permission. That's a beautiful thing. And of course, the whole idea with Judaism, with lighting a candle, right? Actually, it's not only with Judaism, it's a universal idea. So that's beautiful. I wanted to move forward, not move on, because we're continuing this conversation. I wanted to talk to the filmmakers. Maybe Christa would like to respond. Talk a little bit about Salzgeber and the position in the literary and cultural community that you feel that he had and has.
Sure. So, really in the pre-war era, he wasn't born in Vilna, but his youth really was in Vilna, which, as I'm sure you and most viewers know, was a very important center of Jewish culture in Europe. It was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. A very long yichus of being known as a center of Jewish learning. And it's where a lot of Yiddish art makers convened. But he grew up there, and there was a Yiddish literary movement based in Vilna at the time called Young Vilna. And it's a really interesting story with Avram Salzgeber and Young Vilna. There's a piece in the film where he reveals something about how, actually he didn't really want to be part of this, literary group. that he had bigger ambitions, which was really interesting because the other version of the story is that Jung Vilna rejected him at first when he tried to get in. You know, the story that I was told is that at that time, Jung Vilna was really focused, as many of the Yiddish literary movements were, around ideology and art as serving political action and what was going on in the world. And so here comes this young man, poet, who, you know, has from Siberia. His early years were in Siberia, and he's writing these poems about nature, about you know, the human experience, universal themes, and that didn't really fit into what they were going for at the time. But he eventually, you know, as you hear a little bit of this story from Ruth Weiss in the film of how he could have probably gotten in if he wanted to, and eventually he did join Jung Vilna, and was connected to the many wonderful Yiddish writers who came out of Vilna, and was with them in the ghetto. He was with them as some of the Yiddish intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals really, of Vilna were forced into helping. Well, the idea was that the Nazis wanted to set aside important Jewish works, but they created an underground activism of trying to save these materials. And very exciting now, we actually have some of these materials being digitized by various collaborative projects between. So that's a very important part of his story. And then after the war, he ends up deciding to settle in this new country of Israel, even before it was made a nation state. And the rest of his life, you know, rather than adapting as some, you know, rather than deciding to switch to Hebrew, he is committed to Yiddish culture and the Yiddish language as his medium, as his language for the rest of his life. Even though at the time in the early state of Israel, Yiddish was outlawed, there were various laws that prohibited Yiddish publications, he created a Yiddish literary journal, Die Goldene Kate, and that ran for decades up until almost the, you know, very near the end of his life. And he really became a facilitator, really, of post-war Yiddish culture, not only in Israel, but really all over the world, because the Goldene Kate became a vehicle through which Yiddish writers could publish their new works. They could publish things he published many things of writers who had been killed during the war. So this he really was also a mentor and activist for Yiddish through that vehicle and his presence and strong leadership.
Yeah, fantastic. Really, really interesting. Could you talk a little bit, maybe Emily might take this, talk a little bit about the process of making the film? And I know in the film, you know, we're tracing Hadas's journey forwards and backwards and, you know, surrounding herself with her grandfather's experience. But how actually did you put it together, and how long did that take? Was it linear or in different spurts and starts?
Sure. So we began developing the film in the summer of 2015, and we finally locked in 2020. So it took us 5 years to make this movie, and it wasn't your average documentary by any means. You know, we didn't have a production team, or really outright, we didn't know what the narrative vision was really going to be. But I would say that the film began even earlier, because Krista first conducted an interview with Hadas as part of the Wexler Oral History Project's archive on field work to Israel. And she can definitely speak to that mission and how the archive has really served as a foundation of this film, you know, the first feature-length documentary produced by the Yiddish Book Center, and how this film is not just a tribute to Sutzkever's amazing life, but his contribution to and preservation of the Yiddish language and Jewish culture, as is, you know, the Book Center's mission. But really it was, you know, upon receiving Hadas's interview and their discussion following the film, their filming, and all of the amazing artifacts that Hadas provided, all of the family photos and her own home videos of interviewing Sutzkever, it just became evident that this needs to be told. And, you know, of course, as Krista mentioned, you know, we knew Sutzkever was an important Yiddish figure, but there wasn't really a feature film yet about him, about his life and about his poetry. And so we felt that people who knew who he was would want a biography, would love to see a portrait of this artist. And for those who had never heard of him, and I include myself in this because when I came to the Book Center, I did not know about him. You know, we thought, for those who don't know him, what better poet to introduce the world of Yiddish to a global audience? So it really was just a confluence of those, you know, the artifacts and who he was that really, you know, pushed us to go, we need to make this movie.
Right. So interesting, the issues of how you keep culture alive. And, you know, when I think, I was not familiar with his work, I did know of him, but I don't speak Yiddish. And so then there's that other dimension that's interesting because I grew up hearing Yiddish in my household, my grandparents speaking to my mother, and I understand a lot, but I don't speak it. So I'm curious, I don't know, I throw it out to any one of you to sort of respond to the issue of this commitment he made to creating only in Yiddish. Maybe Hadas, do you feel that became a barrier to folks outside of that tradition knowing who he was? And I asked that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I'd like to follow it up with, or maybe now that he did commit to that, it's so pure, the commitment he had to his work. And if people peel it back a little bit, they're going to see something truly authentic because it was never, he never modified his voice, right? By bringing a second voice, Hebrew, English, whatever that might have been.
When you talk about Sutzkever, you must understand that this is a poet that believed in the most horrifying times that he would live because of his Yiddish and because of his poetry. So this is the main thing that went with him through all his life. That as long as he's writing, even in the ghetto, he would live. Right. So every day in the ghetto, he wrote a poem, he wrote poetry. So he said, with my poems, even through the barriers of the ghetto, I am a free man. Mm-hmm. So this is a strong belief. And look, not just the belief, but in effect, he was rescued because of a poem. So this is an unbelievable story about a man that is believing and is in fact living because of his poetry and because of his Yiddish.
Right, and he believed in the power of his own voice.
Yes,
he was living in a time when they were trying to arrest the power of his voice, but lauded him for having such a strong voice. That's like, you know, that's...
Yes, and when he's coming to Israel, the Jewish land, and he's bringing his Yiddish, mm-hmm. that rescued him, and he wants to rescue it back. And then in the Jewish land, they come to say to him, "Oh, but here, no, we don't speak Yiddish. We speak Hebrew." And he said, "Yes, I wasn't afraid of the Goyim. I'm not going to be afraid of the Jewish."
Right. Yeah. So let's talk for a second about the hybrid documentary format. And how the Wexler collection or practices in that project facilitated the how you made the movie and all the different elements you put together to make such a powerful piece.
Well, maybe I can start with that and then I
Sure.
might pass it off to you, Emily, when we get to the editing. But I wanted to revisit what Emily talked about this sort of inception of this project, I'm I see you, Hadas, where you are now, and I remember being in that very room with you after the interview, and I was doing field work. I was doing a very intensive schedule of interviewing lots of Yiddish speakers and people related to Yiddish culture there. But after the interview, you said, "Hey, I have something to show you." And we sat there right where you are now, I think, and watched some of these home videos of Sutzkever in his own home in Tel Aviv with his family. And I thought, this kind of material is just precious. It's priceless, and it gives a different view than you would see in a normal pic type documentary. And it really fit in with the type of film making approach that Emily and I had really established together. So this is not our first film project together. We've done several short documentaries together, also happen to be about Yiddish poets and their descendants. So we had a few practice runs before diving into our first feature, and we developed this method of bringing the Yiddish Book Center has the Wexler Oral History Project. We're making these new recordings, and then we have access to many other archival materials. So we have the book collection, of course, and we have archival recordings that have come to be part of our digital collections. And so how we started is first taking a scan of what do we have even within our building, really our virtual building, our website maybe. And we found recordings of Sutzkever speaking in Montreal. We found recordings of him, which we were so excited about and has become sort of a key part of our style, Emily, is having the author's own voice, reciting his own poetry. And so we already had these amazing riches. At first we thought we were going to do a short, but then it turned out, Hadas sent us a hard drive with all of the videos of the family going, the trip to Vilna, and we realized this was a bigger project. And then, Emily, maybe you can talk about the research that we did from there, and then how we stitched it all together.
Absolutely. Yes. So this is a hybrid documentary, and it's traditional in its overarching story, but it employs three different modes of storytelling and three different kind of archival sources. The first is the first person narrative of Hadas and her journey to Vilna, and so that was the hard drive that Chris is referencing, shot in, a sort of fly on the wall footage, capturing Hadas's emotion in real time as she's experiencing this place for the first time, a place that she has heard so much about, and so many stories from her grandfather with his diary, and she's trying to access and bridge this physical and emotional landscape with the past and of the past with the present. And the oral histories of Hadas, as well as her aunt Mira, who's featured in the film, really guide us through that experience. So we have the first person narrative. Second, we have Sutzkever's biography, and that's written and narrated in the film by Ruth Weiss, a Yiddish scholar. And then that was, that really allowed us to visually represent Sutzkever sort of in the way that we had been doing so sort of before with these other films, with like archival footage, handwritten poems, historical photographs, provided by archives all over the world, and of course Hadas's family. And then the third mode of storytelling is Sutzkever's autobiography. you get to hear him in this film reciting his poems, get to see him telling Hadas stories in their own family home videos, and get to see him at various stages of his life talking about poetry in Yiddish. And so, yeah, we just, these are the three modes that we interwove together and really presented an all new kind of documentary for the Book Center.
It sounds really, really interesting, and it is when you watch it. Talk for a second about the multilingual, multicultural aspects of the film and the extra challenges there. You're forever translating and interpreting and reinterpreting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's luckily we had, Yiddish and English. We had the skills in the building, so that was helpful. But yeah,
The Hebrew.
then we had the Hebrew, which, Hadas had to help us with. It's figuring out how we ended up finding some local people, but that was not an expertise that we necessarily had in the building. And then we found, and then the Nuremberg testimony, we decided that would be an important part of the film, and we wanted to make sure so that's in Russian. So here we have four languages. And what's interesting to me, as someone who spends a lot of time learning about Yiddish speakers, is that they almost always lived in a multilingual context. So Sutzkever grew up in Vilna, which at the time was in Poland. And, so Jews living in Vilna were living a bilingual life. There were different languages in different aspects of their life and professional life, family. And so I think what I kind of love about the film is we're also inviting the audience into a multilingual space that I think in some ways mirrors Sutzkever's own life, both pre-war and post-war, where Yiddish is a Jewish language among other languages.
That's so true. You make an excellent point. Let's move now to talk about poetry as a chronicler of history and culture. I mentioned my dad coming into this program, and I've spent the last 15 years, I think more than I have earlier in my life, exploring his work. And we came across a quote that my dad, in his archives, that talked about poetry as the great connector, and that he himself looked at poetry at one point of just beautiful language, but he recognized in his own life that it was a great connector, interdisciplinary, intersectional, intercultural, etc. And I wanted you to speak to that. First, I think I want to turn to Hadas just to talk for a minute about poetry as that tool in her family. And I'm curious now about the poems, a poem you can think of your grandfather's that you were especially drawn to. So not talking now about a story he might have told you, but a poem you might have read that really piqued your interest because you're a performer, and I'm just curious when that happened for you. How old were you? And, and how you look on that piece of literature now.
I discovered my my grandfather's poems, and not at an early age because of the translations, of course, because I couldn't read them in Yiddish. I grew up in a family that my mother did not speak to me Yiddish. She wanted to be a tzabar, right? Tzabar is the true, the genuine Israeli that is born in Israel and not coming from from Europe, from the war. So she wanted to speak Hebrew, and they spoke to her Yiddish, but she doesn't want to speak to them in Yiddish. So the Yiddish wasn't around me. It wasn't around me. And also that's why it was difficult for me to reach and understand the poems. But later on, when a lot of translation came out to Hebrew, to English. Then I could start reading and understand this world of Sutzkever's poetry. And you know, I have to, because of course about poetry you could ask, you know, scholars, but I want to tell a little story that you will understand how Sutzkever was like for me as a grandfather, but the same thing is in his poetry. Oh, I told you about the healing beauty. And, you know, as a kid, I grew up with all those stories in my head about the war. And every time I went to Europe, I had to go in antique shops to find items from the war because I had to make the stories real. Mm-hmm. I had to make them like physical. And one time I went to this antique shop in Czechoslovakia, and I asked this guy, do you have items from the war? And he said, he was, you know, shaking. He said, yes. And he went to the attic, and then he came down, and on his hand was the yellow star. And it was the first time that I ever saw the yellow star, and it was very symbolic. The yellow star, of course, for the Shoah and the Holocaust days. It's a very symbolized item. And I was shaking and I said, what? And is it for sale? And he said, yes, it costs $200. And I didn't buy. And I came to Israel and I was excited and I said to my grandfather, Abrashe, you do not understand what I saw in Czechoslovakia. I saw this yellow star in this antique shops, and this guy wanted $200 for it. I didn't buy. And then Abrashe is just sitting there very calmly with this little smile here. And he's looking on me, shaking around. And he's saying, $200? Really? That's very interesting because I got it for free.
Yeah.
So this little story tells you that Sutzkever always said, even the sadness can become a smile. And there is a poem that says, you know, at daytime there is a levaya, right, a funeral, and at the night we will have a concert. So it is so nice. If somebody has the translations of the poems, you should look this up. It's beautiful story that gives so much strength to life. Yes, this is how life is, you know. In the morning, we will have a funeral, but at the evening, we will have a concert. And this is how life is.
So you're leading right into another area that is very interesting, to talk about poetry as a form of spirituality, of teaching, offering a moral code. And I know Ruth Weiss's framing of the material in the film is that way. Emily or Christa, who would like to speak to that a little bit?
I can maybe. I mean, I first encountered Sutzkever in a course with one of Ruth Weiss's students, my professor Justin Cami, who I know Hadas knows as well. I encountered his poetry for the first time in a Holocaust literature course, and I think it's really, and that many of the poems that are in the film are of that genre, and I think it's in his earlier poetry as well, sort of looking to the natural world as a way of understanding the world, and poetry as a way of connecting to something larger and beyond the individual human experience. And then that really intensifies when his life circumstance becomes much more intensified. And as Hadas mentioned earlier, I think, Ruth lays out that, he really made almost a pact with the angel of poetry, saying, if I write poetry that is good enough, I will survive. I mean, he really connected it that strongly. And there's another place in the film where he's in 1991 giving a lecture at YIVO in New York, reflecting on the fact that he wrote more during that period, those years of the war, than he did the rest of his life. And how really it's clear, even just in that example, that he was channeling something really deep into the words. He's also known in the Yiddish literary circle of being a real wordsmith. I mean, some people call him the Shakespeare of Yiddish because he would invent words, similar to Shakespeare. He had a very deep connection to the words. And Hadas, when I met you and we were starting to work on this film, shared also that there is a there's sort of something that transcends through his perspective, through the poetry, but also, some people may call it superstition. There were certain numbers in his life, certain things that, circled around there, and so I think the poetry was certainly, from what I have known from reading him for now many years and working on this film, that really was his connection to something greater than his life.
Beautiful. Is there anything else any of you would like to share that we didn't talk about that would be interesting to folks watching the movie?
Well, I would just mention that, if people are interested in learning more, Hadas has talked about how translation has been a great way to access her grandfather's work, and there are new translations out just this year. There's a new translation from the Yiddish Book Center, actually, the White Goat Press, of his prose poetry. And I think that Hadas, the theater piece in that is part of the film actually comes out of one of his prose poem stories. So I would encourage people to. There's a lot more out there in terms of his work and his biography that I would just invite people to dig deeper if they get curious.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming to this or watching this interview today. And I wanted to thank you for making this beautiful movie. And again, I want to thank all of the members of the Miami Jewish Film Festival, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for their continued support throughout all of these years. And thank you, Miami Jewish Festival's audience, for participating in the 24th annual festival. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deborah.
Thank you very much.